facade of objectivity. Physical reality is no less social realities, and knowledge reflects and encodes the dominant ideologies and power relations. So he got this published in a significant social humanities journal, and then announced that it was a spoof, that it was nonsense. Okay? And we all laughed and said it'll never happen here. That was 1996. Then, 20 years later, if this will, here we go. In 2023, the Journal of Chemical Education, here's a piece called "A Special Topics Class in Chemistry on Feminism and Science as a Tool to Disrupt the Disconscious Racism in STEM." And this will give you an example. This article presents an argument on the importance of teaching science with a feminist framework and defines it by acknowledging that all knowledge is historically situated and is influenced by social power and politics. This is funny. In the context of the course, we'll explore the development and interrelationship between quantum mechanics, Marxist materialism, Afrofuturism and pessimism, and post-colonial naturalism. So, give you a sense of the kind of nonsense that's happening now. But it's permeating not just that part, that postmodern nonsense, it's permeating the sociology and governance of science and academia. In my own field of physics, the American Physical Society, which is a dominant organization around the world, right after Trump was elected the first time, they sent out a letter to their membership arguing that a presidential executive order that he did in 2020 on combating race and sex stereotyping was, quote, in direct opposition to the core values of the American Physical Society. What did the order say? It quoted Martin Luther King, stating that in government-supported scientific institutions, people should not be judged by the color of the skin, but the content of their character. That was in direct opposition to the core values of the American Physical Society right after the George Floyd killing. Other scientific leaders who, again, virtue signal to get ahead of the mob, but obviously don't believe what they're really saying, include an old friend of mine, Francis Collins, who's director of the National Institutes of Health for many years. And he apologized in 2020 for the existing, quote, structural racism in biomedical research and pledged to address the problem. Now, what's obviously nonsense about this is he'd been head of the National Institutes of Health for 15 years. If there was structural racism, he should have resigned. Okay? So he was just virtue signaling. There's censoring people in many ways in academia. One of them is loyalty oaths put out by these diversity, equity, and inclusion groups. And you'll hear more about that kind of nonsense from Geoff, I think, next. But for example, in universities for a long time, in order to get a job, you had to basically fill out a loyalty oath as well as describing your research. And it got so bad that the Life Sciences Department at the University of California, Berkeley, these would be read before your research date, okay? They rejected 76% of the applications for a professor in biology solely on the basis of the diversity, equity, and inclusion statement without looking at the research. And by the way, in that kind of statement, just saying I don't judge people by the skin, color, or gender, that would not, you would definitely not make it through the cut just for that. And so, and basically every university was doing it. But in Canada, it's even worse. Because in Canada, as Bruce will talk about, there's legalized discrimination. It's the perfect example of two wrongs apparently making a right. And in Canada, it's legal if a group was discriminated against a long time ago to discriminate against others now. And it's affecting science in Canada. And here are some ads for University of Waterloo. A Canada research chair in climate change, water, or future studies. And they want, the best possible researcher. This call is open only to qualified individuals who self-identify as a woman, transgender, non-binary, or two-spirit. It's legal here. It's not legal in the States. Effectively, it ends up happening, but it's illegal to actually state it. In University of Guelph, another Canada research chair, the successful candidate will be an outstanding and innovative world-class researcher in experimental physics whose accomplishments have made a major impact in their field. Great. Candidates must be from one or more of the following equity-seeking groups to apply: women, persons with disabilities, indigenous groups, or racialized groups. So you have to be great, but only great depending upon the label. This became further legitimized in the past Liberal government, and in fact it was determined that Canada research chairs, which are the highest endowed chairs the government created many years ago to get expatriate like Canadians like me to try and come back to Canada to do their research. They announced that by 2029, the number of Canada research chairs had to match exactly the demographics of the background population. So 50.9% must be women and gender minorities, 22% must be racialized minorities, 7.5% must be people with disabilities, and 4.9% must be Indigenous. This is independent of the applicant pool. And it means that places like the University of Toronto said, and have said, they will no longer, for the next 5 years, consider any white males in any of these positions of engineering, dentistry, medicine, and various other disciplines. It's ridiculous. There's, on top of that, there's cancel culture, and we'll hear about that from Francis, who was canceled the faculty are not just censured, like very distinguished chemist Thomas Budlicki at Brock University, who was essentially censured by his university and by the journal in which he published for suggesting that merit should be the basis of promotion in chemistry. And then Francis Widdowson here, who was removed from a tenured position for questioning, for simply ultimately creating a hostile environment by asking a question about Indigenous knowledge and astronomy. And she'll talk about that and other things. Language has become, for many people, a form of violence, and it's restricting what can be said. Of course, gender is a big issue. You're not allowed to. There's one of the women in the book here, Carol Hooven, was essentially drummed up at Harvard for saying on Fox News that there were two sexes. Sex is binary. But it's in medicine, where lives depend upon this, not just discussions, there is an infusion of this nonsense and rigidity. And we'll hear, of course, more about that in a different context from Dr. Kulvinder Kaur Gill, who will talk about her issues about openness and free speech in medicine. But the American Association of Medical Colleges informed medical schools that they must employ anti-racist and unconscious bias training and engage in interracial dialogues. But in Canada, it's even worse. The Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons said, came up with CanMeds 2025, which is a new guide for teaching. And at the end of their discussion, they say, a new model of CanMeds would seek to center values such as anti-oppression, anti-racism, and social justice rather than medical expertise. I think most people who go to a doctor would probably prefer the latter. Okay? This is how bad it gets. Then this infuses the media. And this is really a real problem. Journals are the gatekeepers in science, but scientific journals have decided that offense is more important than knowledge. The Royal Society of Chemistry sent out an edict to their editors, basically saying that they're going to minimize the possibility of offense. Offense is a subjective matter, and sensitivity to its spans a considerable range. However, we must bear in mind it is the perception of the recipient that we should consider, regardless of the author's intention. And therefore, you have to consider whether any content might offend anyone. And you say, okay, well, maybe they'd do this rationally. But offensive content was defined as any content that could reasonably offend someone on the basis of their age, gender, race, sexual orientation, religious or political beliefs, marital or parental status, physical features, national origin, social status, or disability. Find some other way to offend someone and I'll be amazed. Nature, which used to be a wonderful journal, Nature Behavior, said they will reject articles that might potentially harm, even inadvertently, those individuals or groups most vulnerable to racism, sexism, ableism, or homophobia, whether or not the science is correct. Okay? And we're going to hear Jonathan Kay talk about the media and his perception of what's going on and whether this kind of censorship plays a role in the media and how that's perceived by the public. So I just want to end, it'd be nice to go back to the good old days of 1710, when Anton von Leeuwenhoek, he developed the microscope, and he wrote to the president of the Royal Society, he discovered spermatozoa. And he said, if this seems offensive, if this article seems offensive, don't publish it. But fortunately, for the progress of biology, the Royal Society published the results, because those were the good old days when you could publish offensive results. And we want to get back to that. And I'm really happy to have the panel here to talk about the problems in different contexts, and I'll try to sort of introduce those context, and we'll go along to my right, and we'll proceed from there. I want to start with Geoff Horsman, who's a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at Wilfrid Laurier, and he also co-chairs the campus chapter of Heterodox Academy. And he's going to provide some examples of sort of what he calls the twin academic vices of mendacity and cowardice. Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Lawrence. I was waiting for you to talk about the conceptual penis as a social construct. I was a great person to come up. Well, honesty and courage are two ingredients for human flourishing and essential preconditions for science. Not the only two, to be sure, but I mention these specifically because these values have so quickly been diminished in the academy and replaced by their opposites, mendacity and cowardice. It started out innocently enough. We were just asked to reflect on seemingly unobjectionable sets of principles. Equity? That's just fairness. Diversity? Sure, solutions to problems can come from all sorts of places. Inclusion? What's not to like about inclusion? But equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI as it's known officially in Canada, is like a gateway drug. While some of us briefly experimented back in the day, Canadians who disagree with EDI. A senior university administrator then told me that it's okay to disagree with EDI, as long as reviewers assume otherwise from my application. This incentivization of lying works. A colleague told me as much. He said, I've made my peace with EDI. I will lie about my most deeply held convictions on paper in order to get funding. This is a dangerous game. When you start lying, when do you stop? The public would be correct to entirely lose trust in us. But perhaps more pernicious is the slippery mendacity of EDI language. Let me give you an example. My university introduced a program called Inclusive Excellence, which aimed to hire 6 Black and 6 Indigenous faculty. Now, you might think that when introducing a program based so openly on racial discrimination, a university legal team might have carefully considered possible legal challenges. You might think they would have prepared a detailed report establishing, to a high evidentiary standard, the existence of systemic discriminatory hiring against Black and Indigenous scholars. Well, you would think wrong. The only justification for the program I could find is the following quote from our president. This is beautiful. Inclusive excellence embodies our vision to fully embrace discovery, scholarly exploration, and application of new ideas while engaging and challenging the world in all its complexity. This is what I call diversity. It means whatever you want it to mean. It is lying by omission. Everyone wants to pretend they are not participating in racial discrimination, but have no idea how to justify it in plain language. So they deploy diversity. Let me now turn to cowardice. Professors, tenured professors, are a fearful lot. In my chapter, I describe how a colleague suggested I should stop talking about EDI because I have a family. I should think about my kids, he suggested. Because we all know how quickly these things can get out of hand, cancel culture. How has it come to this, where a university, of all places, has so cowed professors, even or perhaps especially art scientists? Well, that's a long story, so let me instead leave you with what I think is key to getting us out of this mess. I'd say this: don't do their work for them. Don't self-censor. Don't go along with things. Make them force you, because they don't want to. It makes them look like petty bullies. They don't want to look like bullies. So much of the time they will back off. But if they don't, that's okay. Make them be bullies. Others will see it, and some will have their eyes open. If you go along to get along, we can keep pretending we are free as we are ever more managed and controlled. When a feckless administrator tells you what to think or what to say, be like the Spartans at Thermopylae. say, okay, you're going to have to make me. And by the way, I'd like that in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When Jeff's colleague awarded him, your family or kids, you should worry about talking. He might have been talking about Frances Widdowson, who was wrongfully terminated from a tenured position at Mount Royal University in 2021, and her case is now being appealed by the Alberta Labour Relations Board on December 3rd, and we hope that appeal will be successful. She's going to talk about indigenization in the university's Hall of Shame, as she calls it, and how spectrum-street epistemology can break the self-censorship that's contributing to the destruction of academic values. And I should say both Geoff and Frances, along with Bruce Pardy, are three people here who have articles in the book. Frances.
Thanks very much. Lawrence, is this on? Yeah, good. This is going to be very insensitive. I'm just wondering. So, I have a few bones to pick with my friends. And first of all, I am not a former professor. I am a wrongfully terminated professor who is demanding reinstatement from Mount Royal University. And my case is going before the Alberta Labour Relations Board on December 3rd. And there are going to be 6 journalists. It's public, and there are going to be 6 journalists that are going to be watching the ridiculous proceedings that are going to unfold. Such as, although I was wrongfully terminated, I cannot be reinstated because of friction that exists between me and some of my colleagues because they feel unsafe, because I say things like, there are only 2 sexes, woo! Indigenous science is not science, and the residential schools were not genocidal. That, all of those ideas are completely justifiable, and the refutation of them is ridiculous and has no evidence to support. The opposition has no evidence which is convincing. But I cannot be reinstated at Mount Royal University, says the arbitrator, because my colleagues object to those ideas being expressed in a university. And if people are not upset about this, they should be upset, and they should be coming and helping me to fight against the universities and not tone policing me. That is which is what they are doing. So, friction at the universities. This happens every single university that I go to now. There is friction that exists, and this results in cancellation, which happened at the University of Lethbridge, which I talked about in the book that Lawrence has edited, and also at the University of Regina and at the University of Manitoba. They demanded between $2,000 and $5,000 as a security fee, which I did not want my organization, the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, to have to pay. I said, piss off, University of Manitoba, we're coming in to do the spectrum street epistemology anyway. And this is due to equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology, which has captured the institutions. Geoff has just talked about that, but I just wanted to add a bit of concreteness to what equity is. Equity is demanding proportionate representation in the professional managerial class. So if you've got 7% of the population that is Indigenous, 7% of the professional managerial class should be Indigenous. And if you say anything that upsets the Indigenous, you should be pushed out because they will leave that institution and go somewhere else. That's what happened at Mount Royal University with Gabrielle Weaselhead. who was very upset about me saying that Indigenous science was not science, and she left, so they fired me and brought her back in 2 months after I was fired. Figure it out. It's not hard to do. So, what is to be done about this situation of the capture of universities? And in the piece that I wrote in this book, I recommended three kinds of solutions. One is institutional neutrality, get rid of indigenization, and demanding that faculty members respect Indigenous ways of knowing. Indigenous ways of knowing are unscientific. They will destroy your university if you demand that this be respected. Governance. Universities are corporations that sell a product. You've got to get rid of that, and the way you do that is that you have all the administration elected by the faculty members. The problem, however, is the faculty members are all activists, and this is a problem with the hiring that has been happening for the last 10, 20, 30 years. So the real solution is changing the culture of the universities. Getting the professors to be able to embrace critical thinking, examining diverse perspectives, and so on. And this is really where the battle has got to be fought. And how is the battle going to be fought? Spectrum Street epistemology. This is a secret weapon. This is an incredible method that is very, very suited to universities. It was initiated by Peter Boghossian, a professor who's pushed out of Portland State. And what this does, and I'm not sure people are familiar with this method, but you have 7 mats from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and you have neutral in the middle. You bring these mats into the university. You don't need to book space, because if you book space, you'll be canceled. So you just bring those mats in, and I've done this at a number of universities. And this breaks down both censorship and self-censorship. The censorship is getting a trespass notice. I got those from the University of Winnipeg and Thompson Rivers University. Piss off. We're doing the Spectrum Street epistemology. Arrest me. If you arrest me, we will discuss your embarrassment of an institution and how you have been basically spreading misinformation about the unmarked graves for the last 4.5 years. And they won't do it at this stage. They might in the future, but they're not doing it right now. And so that the remains of 215 children are buried there because not one parent has said that their child went missing. From that, so who are the 200? And it's not 215 anyway. It's 200 anomalies, because 15 of those remains were found in the 2000s by the Simon Fraser Archaeology Department to be shovel test pits. So if Sarah Bollier was wrong on the 15, why isn't she wrong on the other 200? And she probably is. But of course the Kamloops Indian Band won't excavate, even though it received $12.1 million to do the excavations. So I've been going across the country doing the Spectrum Street epistemology and compiling my University's Hall of Shame, which are universities who act inappropriately to an actual academic discussion happening at their university. But then we have the elite Hall of Shame, the Hall of Shame of the Hall of Shame, which is the University of Winnipeg, which the president just got fired. I hope he got fired because of what happened there on September 26th, which was my camera. We went in there to do the Spectrum Street epistemology on Negon Sinclair's claim that residential school denialism is a barrier to reconciliation, which he argued 2 hours before in an event. My cameraman feared for his life, Daniel Page. He thought he was going to get stabbed by a bunch of Indigenous gangsters who pushed him off the campus. It's all that the footage has all been provided. provided. This should have been national news. It was not. We had the Free Speech Union sent a letter to the University of Winnipeg. We had the Justice Center, we're pursuing it right now. 7 women assaulted me, roughed me up, poured a soft drink over my head. Daniel Page got punched in the face. And we were working on this, but no members of the national media covered this situation, and even Jonathan Key, who is notable for his covering ridiculous university situations, never said a word about it. We must criticize our friends, just like we criticize our friends.
Yeah, where's this K guy?
Give him the due.
Anyway, and why did this not happen? Why are the media not covering these ridiculous things? Because I'm insensitive. I use words like, well, I didn't use words. I asked a question. Is the Great Eric Kamloops a hoax? I asked that. And hoax is not a word you should be using. Because it's upsetting to the indigenous tribal elites and their allies. And they send nasty emails and they call you a racist and a colonizer and all these kinds of things. And my word choice is very offensive. For example, this is going to be very offensive. I defend Pierre Valliere, the Quebec Marxist. His book title, White Niggers of America. I will not back down. I will die on that hill, because Pierre Valliere was making a very important point, that the discrimination and horrible treatment of people is because of class, not race. That was his point, and his title was a rhetorical device that was helping people to understand that situation. Gabrielle Weaselhead mounted a mobbing campaign against me at Mount Royal University because I defended Pierre Valliere's book title. That happened. So, we cannot separate content from form. Our form helps us to realize and understand the content. And for people who are tone policing me, shame on you. Stop doing it. The time for sensitivity has long passed. By doing this, you are destroying freedom of thought. Our freedom of thought depends upon us having access to both the form and the content, which allows us to pursue the truth. And the pursuit of truth is never more needed than it is at this moment. Thank you very much.
I just wish you'd say what you mean every now and then. Yeah, I very proudly have that book, White Niggers in America, on my bookshelf. Next, speaking of, so this is one kind of cancellation, but people can be canceled in other areas by, again, speaking out against political or popular misconceptions, or just question whether they're misconceptions. And our next panelist, Dr. Kulvinder Kaur Gill, is a specialist physician in Ontario and previously conducted scientific research in immunology, virology, and vaccinology at Canada's only level 4 biosafety facility. And she's co-founder and president of Concerned Ontario Doctors, through which she's advocated for in the interest of Canadian physicians and patients. Now, she's going to focus on this thing called scientific consensus, which became a big issue during the COVID era, and how it's been used to silence scientific inquiry. And she's going to draw on her personal experiences, which is largely being attacked for questioning the consensus, or at least the policies based on what claim to be consensus. So, your turn.
Thank you for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
No.
Is that better?
No.
Better now?
Real close, real close.
How is that? I just wanted to thank Lisa and the Free Speech Union of Canada for organizing this event, and for all of you wonderful people for making the trek out this evening. For those of you who are unfamiliar with my journey over the last 5 years, I just wanted to briefly touch upon that before I share some thoughts, some dangerous thoughts, I'm told, by government and its entities, that it makes me dangerous to share opinions that contradict the government. And I'm then putting all of you in danger, because you are all hearing opinions that contradict the government narrative. So please be warned. So my legal saga with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario started in the summer of 2020, when I started naively, as I always do, just expressing evidence-based opinions online, specifically Twitter at the time, that opposed the government's narrative on lockdowns. And very quickly there was a targeted online campaign against me, and people started to file complaints to my professional regulator, the CPSO, and I became the target of a very high-level registrar's investigation, which is the highest level of investigation possible into an Ontario physician, looking at all aspects of my practice, simply for expressing opinions online that oppose the government. I had said that there was no medical or scientific evidence for this prolonged and harmful lockdown, #FactsNotFear. That made me very dangerous. Keep in mind, at that time when I expressed that opinion, polling in Canada showed that only 7% of Canadians oppose lockdowns. So I was expressing a very unpopular opinion. And even though it was grounded in evidence. At the time, after a very lengthy investigation, the CPSO in February of 2021 ordered 3 simultaneous cautions against me, and said specifically that it was that physicians should not express opinions that contradict the government's public health messaging during the pandemic. So they weren't stating that what I was saying was false. They were stating that I was expressing an opinion that was contrary to the government, and that made me dangerous. And specifically in their caution, they had stated, "Her statement does not align with the information coming from public health. The lockdowns in China and South Korea provide evidence that lockdowns can and did work in reducing the spread of COVID-19. For the respondent to state otherwise is misinformed and misleading, and furthermore, an irresponsible statement to make on social media during the pandemic." In the caution orders, I was threatened that if I did not attend and appear for the cautions immediately, this would be escalated. Instead of attending the cautions, I then appealed through my counsel, and CPSO did not like that very much, because I continued to tweet opposing lockdowns and then opposing mandates, and they then ordered a second high-level investigation, retroactive to their first. And I, during a 3-year period, had more than 40 CPSO investigators assigned to me. They cataloged thousands and thousands of my tweets. Eventually, they referred this to the disciplinary panel in October of 2022. At that time, Lisa was my counsel, and we were trying to clarify what they considered to be, quote, misinformation in my tweets, and the committee for the CPSO would not advise us what was misinformation, and said that that is up for debate at the tribunal. So once it was referred to the tribunal, I then, through Lisa, had requested a fully contested hearing at the CPSO, which would have been public. And I started to retain experts to defend every single one of my tweets that they cataloged, over 10,000 of them. And suddenly, in September of 2023, when we had scheduled the hearing to begin in early 2024, the CPSO abruptly withdrew their disciplinary hearing against me without any explanation. So that disappeared, and I'm still practicing as a physician as I have always been. I have absolutely no restrictions on my license. But the battle continued for my original caution. Appeal anything to the Supreme Court, you need their permission, which is considered to be leave. And so there's no explanation given, but basically what that meant was that the Ontario Court of Appeal decision held. And the Ontario Court of Appeal decision was that they were giving deference to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. So facts didn't matter. Whether I was right or wrong didn't matter. They were just simply giving deference to the administrative body. And what they omitted to mention in their decision was that the CPSO's committee gave deference to the government. So it was a positive feedback loop. So essentially, no one can oppose government, and the government narrative is deemed to be fact. Whether it is based on falsehoods or propaganda, it doesn't matter. And so in August of 2025, so just a few months ago, I finally appeared virtually before the CPSO to actually receive my cautions. And during that meeting, they reaffirmed their same statements that they had originally said in 2021. So they still believe lockdowns can and do work because of China, and furthermore, they still reaffirm their initial statement to all Ontario physicians, which was, your comments or actions can cause patient and public harm if you are providing an opinion that does not align with information coming from public health or government. It is important that the public receive a clear and consistent message. So during my cautions, I was advised to appear alone in private. I was denied any family member, any support person. I was denied a legal counsel. I was told I could not record the event. But I prepared a public statement, which I then released publicly after I was cautioned. So that is out there in the public realm for anyone who has interest to read it. But I read that statement to the committee of the CPSO when they were issuing their cautions to me. My question I posed to them at the end was, after reviewing the Declaration of Geneva, my faith as a Sikh, after going over the Hippocratic Oath, and the scientific method, which demands that narratives and hypotheses be challenged and questioned, which of these ethical and moral obligations they wanted me to set aside to avoid such cautions since 2020 and moving forward. And they never answered my question. So I'm considered to be a dangerous repeat offender. I have 3 caution orders still on my public record, and it states there that I'm dangerous because I oppose lockdowns. And I think it's very scary that an entire narrative that is built upon propaganda and lies and fear and hysteria cannot be questioned with peer-reviewed public scientific evidence. And I think it's even more dangerous that we have a judicial system that is supposed to be independent of government and hold government to account. And instead of fulfilling that duty, our judicial system is in fact protecting the government and violating our constitutional rights and freedoms. there's something known as a standard of correctness and a standard of reasonableness, which are legal terms I've learned and have become the bane of my existence in the last few years. And in constitutional matters, the standard of review should be correctness, meaning that when a Canadian's charter rights are violated, the courts have an obligation to ensure that the decisions are being made on facts and evidence. However, what is happening in our court system and what happened in my case was that the standard of review was considered to be one of reasonableness. So it didn't matter what the facts were or what the truth was. All that mattered was that it was a reasonable decision. And in the court's view, for the CPSO committee to defer to the government expertise, which is a blind expertise, we never saw the evidence because it doesn't exist to support their decisions, that is considered to be reasonable. So I think once you deduce that, then it's possible to be living in a unobjective reality. And then if we don't have truth as the basis of our reality, then we don't have anything. So I really don't know where this leads us going forward, and I think that's a good segue for Bruce's thoughts in terms of the legal paradigm and infrastructure that maintains all these falsehoods.
Thank you. Indeed, the order is done this way because it did seem like a good idea that after this particular talk that we should turn to Bruce Pardy, who's Professor of Law at Queen's University and Executive Director of Rights Pro, which is a law and liberty think tank, and he's not only also a contributor to the book, but also a colleague on the board of the Free Speech Union, and he's going to talk about the law.
Yeah, and that is a great segue. Because I think there's an idea that we need to purge from our own heads, because it's holding us back. And the idea is this: we think that the law is supposed to be based upon the truth. And it is not. The law is based upon authority. Public authorities are granted the power to decide the public good. Now, here's what happens. We want to debate what the public good is. That's the wrong end of the stick. Here's the description of the power. Public authorities have the power to decide the public good. What's the problematic part of that statement? People look to public good. Public good is like beauty. It lies in the eyes of the beholder. We should focus on the first bit. And the first bit is the power to decide. Public authorities have the power to decide. If they decide the public good, that's the public good. Your facts don't matter. This is what happened during COVID. People saw what was happening and got the inkling that it didn't make sense. And they said, how can this be? This must be illegal because the science isn't right. And we found out, as many of us predicted, that the courts did not agree, because the courts were not assessing the facts. The courts were assessing authority. Does this body have the authority to do what it is doing? And most of the time, the answer was yes. So, the point is this: the law is not your friend. The law is not a solution. And of course, this does vary from country to country. In the US, DEI exists in spite of the Constitution. In Canada, DEI exists because of the Constitution. So in the US, DEI is slowly being beaten back. The US Supreme Court said last year, confirmed last year, that the rule under the American Constitution is equal protection of the law. You cannot apply different rules to different groups of people based upon race or sex or gender or disability or so on. It is unconstitutional to do so. Now, it's still happening, but it's getting beaten back. In Canada, the story is very different. In fact, it is opposite. We do have a section in our charter that appears to say the same thing. Section 15.1 of the charter appears to say that everybody is entitled to the same rules and standards as everybody else. Equal protection under the law, equal treatment of the law. But in the Canadian Constitution, unlike the American, we have an exception. Section 15.2. And Section 15.2 says, oh, but it's okay. If you want to have a program of affirmative action or reverse discrimination, it doesn't use those words, but this is what it means, to ameliorate the position of disadvantaged groups, then that's okay. Now, okay, so you have a rule and an exception. You know, maybe you can live with that. Here's what's happened over the past 35 to 40 years. The Supreme Court of Canada has essentially said that the exception is the rule, and that both of parts of that section that I described mean that you can and sometimes must apply different rules to different groups of people. In other words, all of the ads that Lawrence said for jobs that are reserved for people of different races or sexes or genders and so on are utterly, completely legal and constitutional in this. Much bigger than you might think. It is more fundamental than you might think. Our biggest obstacle, if I can put it this way, is our own disbelief that this is actually the way it could be. We have a system of courts in this country which our Supreme Court Chief Justice has called progressive, and proudly so. It is those progressive courts that insisted that this is the way it's going to be. Now, as far as science is concerned, for my money, one of the reasons that science has gone off the track is that it is now regarded to be a public good. Because public goods call for state supervision, control, regulation, subsidization. Public goods are inevitably political. And when something is political, the truth does not matter. So I would prefer a country in which, in my blue sky ideal dreaming moments, in which science is a completely private activity. No subsidies, no regulation. Doctors allowed to say whatever they think is right, at the risk of some of them being wrong. Here's the thing, when you have regulation that's justified in the public interest to restrict what doctors can say, then you are assuming that what the regulator is requiring them to say is going to in fact be accurate. And you can see that that is not true. So the rationale for having the system that we have, I think during COVID, was shown to be a complete and utter failure. In any event, I think we're in a very bad spot. In scientific terms, in medical terms, but especially in legal terms. And don't think that getting out of this mess is going to be accomplished by anything other than a fundamental rethink about how this country works. I know that that is going to be very unlikely, but you have to start by understanding the problem that lies before you and not be distracted by one's own wishful thinking. Over to you.
All of this, and his perception of Canada versus the rest of the world, and is it getting better or worse? And I know whatever I asked him to talk about, he's going to talk about whatever he wanted. So go ahead.
No, I'm going to at least pay the respect of nominally segueing from that after a few seconds. Because science is in the title, so I'm going to talk about science.
Okay, good.
So I interviewed you on the podcast, and the funny thing about science is when I started my journalistic career, I got all the science stories because I was the only one in the newsroom who had a science degree. So in the early part of my life, I did a master's degree in engineering, and my specialty was engineering thermodynamics, and I wrote computer models of pyrometallurgical operations, basically molten metal, convective, conduction, heat flows, and that was my life. And I just lived inside a Fortran program for 2 years of my life. Turns out I wasn't very good at like actual lab work or anything requiring like real life skills. You weren't actually programming a computer to do something. You actually had to go to a manufacturing plant or laboratory and do stuff yourself. It's kind of insurance risk. So I ended up going to law school, but I never lost the scientific frame of mind. And so when I was a journalist, whenever, like there's certain terms, as soon as people see terms like standard deviation, it's like massive fright goes over their face, and so I would get assigned those stories, and it led to my first book. So I wrote a book about 9/11 conspiracy theorists. And one of the reasons I was the one who wrote the book is because I was the only one who would enjoy going to their conspiracy theory conferences, and they'd get these like engineers and architects to spin this nonsense about like the melting point of steel, and ordinary journalists, many journalists were intimidated by the technical talk because they couldn't understand it. So when they were talking about, say, the structural steel, WTC1 and WTC2, I said, okay, let's talk about it. I did a lot of classes in steel making. I'd love to hear about this. And so as a result, I ended up writing a book. And when I went into that book, I thought the actual substance of the conspiracy theories would be what interested me, but that wasn't what interested me. What interested me was why very smart people believe scientific misinformation. Because the people I interviewed dozens of conspiracy theories for the book, they were all smarter than me. They all knew more about 9/11 than I did. Because if you've ever debated a conspiracy theorist, they know more than you. Because you're just kind of saying, oh yeah, the moon landing, I'm pretty sure that was like a real thing. But you're debating someone who spent like 30 years investigating the moon landing, right? And so even if their conclusion about the moon landing, being conducted in a soundstage in Orange County or something like that is nonsense, they know more about the moon landing than you will ever know. And that was the same thing with 9/11. So these people, these people who say, well, the cure for scientific misinformation is just educating people. That is absolutely not the cure. Most people I know who believe anti-vaxxer conspiracy theories know a lot about vaccines, and they will be able to recite to you chapter and verse of every vaccine scandal that's happened, all the way back to the invention of smallpox vaccine, which was a success back then. And the same is true of 9/11 conspiracy theories. People have a lot of information. It's just you have to be a specialist in order to process it. And I've had arguments on the left and right. One of the reasons I originally left the National Post, a conservative publication, was a lot of my colleagues went in for anti-global warming conspiracies. And I feel like we should listen to oceanographers and climatologists. No, the hockey stick, this. It's like, you guys, honestly, like, and they had some cherry-picked oceanographers and climatologists who said, that's all a hoax. It's like, no, it's not a hoax. And so then I went to the Walrus, which is a progressive publication, and kind of like everything was in reverse. And like, finally, people believe in global warming. And then, what? I have to believe in gender weighing? Okay, that's a problem. But what I gradually understood on the left and the right is that the strongest force in the life of many intellectuals is avoiding intellectual cognitive dissonance. People tend to have a theory of good and evil in the world, and intellectuals perhaps more so, because they live in their own minds. And they avoid information, or they try and contextualize information, or they try and mangle information in a way that does not challenge their theory of good and evil. So if your theory of evil is that the United States is the primary force for evil in the world, and you know that 9/11 was an evil thing, how do you bridge that with a theory of how 9/11 was secretly orchestrated by Dick Cheney and George Bush? It's so obvious. And then the theory may be nonsense, but if you have that theory in your head, you've reconciled two facts. Well, reconciled the fact that 9/11 was an evil thing with your normative moral view that the United States is the primary source of evil in the world, and you've reconciled it. You can sleep at night. None of your friends will talk to you because you believe in batshit things, but it doesn't matter. You know, you can sleep at night. You've reconciled this thing. If you believe that COVID is evil and terrible, but you also believe that dirigist government policies in the area of public health are inherently bad and evil and misguided and misinformed, there's a pretty good chance you're going to find your way to anti-vaxxer conspiracy theories and beliefs that pharmaceutical companies are trying to kill us, and find a way to like pretend away all these peer-reviewed studies about the safety of COVID vaccines. And you're going to convince yourself that, you know, no, I'm not getting vaccinated. Those things are poison. And because you've developed, you know, you've got to reconcile those things. And when Justin Trudeau tells you that you're a racist and a xenophobe because you're just going to double down, because he embodies your theory of evil in the universe. And if he's telling you to do this, well, that just proves I'm right. People, I tell people, you can take away their angels, but never take away their demons. They freak out. They have a theory of evil of the world, and that theory of evil tends to stay pretty stable for a lot of people. You know those like leftists you went to college with? They were Maoists back in the 60s and 70s. Like, often you find them and they're still babbling about this stuff. Like everything has changed, but their views are the same, or at least their theory of evil in the universe is the same. And you see this a lot, you see it in identity politics, this urge to avoid ideological congruence leads people to crazy places. So about 10 years ago, you had this very well-intentioned project to bring human rights to transgender people, which was a well-intentioned project. I'm not that old, but I remember turning on Benny Hill when I was a kid. Remember the old sketches where Benny Hill would dress up as a woman and they play the wacky music, and it was totally transphobic. It was you were allowed to make fun of that stuff. And so people said, look, let's try and educate ourselves. Let's make sure you can rent apartments to trans people and they have the same human rights. Fine, I agree with all that stuff. And also, trans women are the same as regular women in biology is a myth, right? It's like, no, that's not true. However, if you become wedded to the idea of fighting transphobia and the idea that trans women are women, and that becomes your life, and people who believe otherwise are evil and terrible people who must be debunked, you will gradually convince yourself that biology is like a colonial myth. And I have met people, progressives, who actually believe that when Jacques Cartier and Henry Hudson and Samuel de Champlain arrived in what is now North America, it was just one big gender-weighing, eight-spirited festival where no one knew what a penis is. And it was like, oh, penis, is that what we have? We don't believe in sex and we're all gender fluid, so we have no idea. And they've convinced themselves that this is actually what the 17th century history of the exploration of North America was like. It's just like teaching indigenous people the original sin of biology because they didn't know. And it's nonsense, but they have come to believe it because incorporating that mythology is the only way they can conceptualize the idea that, well, you know, anybody who opposes having male boxers beat the crap out of women at the Olympics, that they're a transphobe. The only way they can reconcile that view with their convictions is to somehow imagine that the science of biological sex is mistaken. And these aren't dumb people. They're in a church. This is their dogma. And you see this with 250 unmarked graves. I agree with Francis. It's nonsense. It's been 4.5 years. We all know where to buy a shovel. Black Friday, you can buy like 10 for 50 cents. And, $12.1 million later, no bodies, no remains. I agree with her on that. But the reason that story took off, I believe that story. When I first saw that story, it's May 27, 2021, I was like, yeah, those residential school bastards. Because we've all been conditioned to believe, like, this is like, these were demons running the school, right? And I swallowed a lot of stuff, and then the weeks passed, I was like, okay, where are the bodies? So, bodies weren't there, and then I was like, there's no bodies. But it accorded with a certain view of the people who ran residential schools as being like Darth Vader, or villains from a horror movie, which is kind of what a lot of people have come to expect morality tales to be like. That the people who ran these schools wasn't just higher than expected rates of death from, say, tuberculosis, which itself is unconscionable and terrible, but there was actual mass murder going on, which is complete nonsense. But people liked, in some grotesque way, wanted that to be true because it breathed life into their theory of evil. The idea that colonialism is evil, not just evil in the sense of taking away people's languages and culture, but actually mass murdering children and throwing them into strangely regularly spaced unmarked graves. And it accorded with our horror movie vision of morality, that like, evil will present itself as the villain of a horror movie, and that good will present itself as a martyred child. This is a kind of concept of good and evil in Western society, martyrs, evildoers. And smart people get sucked into this. And like I said, if you try and take away that demonology from it, they go nuts. I mean, when Francis goes to these campuses and tells people like they haven't done it, they know they haven't done it. Right? They're not stupid. But they hate her all the more. Her story was named by the Canadian press the story of the year for 2021. Think about that. Think about how mortifying it is for every journalist in Canada, including me, but I believed it, to admit this, for every politician, every member of Trudeau's Brat Pack who put out those tear-soaked tweets about, the conscience of Canada has been stained forever. The flags were lowered for 6 months. It's mortifying to say it was all a farce, like, man, were we stupid, what were we smoking? So no one wants to talk about it. The question is, and I'll wrap up, and this goes to the tone policing thing that Francis was talking about. If you go to the campus and rub their face in it, they're not going to say, you're right, Francis, thanks for that. I needed someone to slap me across the face and tell me what an idiot I was. That's not how human psychology works. They double down. The same thing when Trudeau went on TV and he said in French, when he called anti-vaxxers racists and xenophobes. You think there was a single anti-vaxxer in the country who was like, oof, I don't want to be one of those. Load me up. Like, people double down. And that's why I use the term tone police, and it's not up to me to do it, but when I talk about unmarked graves, when I talk about vaccines, when I talk about 9/11, when I talk about global warming, I try not to try and give people an honorable way out. First of all, I often, like, unmarked graves, I say, I was fooled. Like, I was one of you, my brother. The scales have fallen from my eyes. Like, I try not to insult them, I try not to challenge them, and I don't go to their church to tell them that they're heretics. Like, even if you're an anti-Islamist activist, you don't protest a mosque because people think you're a dick. For that reason, you don't go to a college campus necessarily where it's like the heart of darkness where it comes to a lot of this stuff. And I wouldn't, I mean, it should be legal, and I don't think you should be arrested for it. And I certainly don't think anybody should dump in a beverage in your head for it. But you're not going to convince anybody. They're just going to double down, as people always double down, because again, the greatest pain people often feel as intellectuals, or as activists, or politicians, academics, is the dissonance that always exists between the facts of the real world and their cherished theories, especially their theories about the locus of human evil. And you have to be really sensitive when you're challenging that, not because it's a legal requirement, but because psychologically that's not how change happens. You don't affect psychological, because this is a psychological phenomenon. This isn't a legal phenomenon. The main source of misinformation on science in Canada isn't the government. It's the intellectual reflexes of the intellectual class who don't want to lose touch, lose their convictions, which are very precious to them, even in the face of irreconcilable facts. So I think it's great that these people like Lisa are helping people vindicate their legal rights when it comes to this sort of stuff. But I'm not optimistic enough to think, well, that's going to make things change. What's going to make things change is when people come around to changing their view of the world in light of facts. And that's something you have to lead them to. You can't force them to do. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we did both two things. We started with late and we went over, but I do want to, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists one question and give you about a minute to answer. And then we're going to take a break, and you can write down your questions, which we'll filter, and drink or whatever, and then we'll come back for a Q&A. So, quick question for each of you. Geoff, you talked about DEI, and Bruce alluded to the difference in the U.S., but the question is, so in the U.S. it is largely ending. Most universities that require DEI statements for postdocs and even students and faculty before they get jobs, those are now disappearing. And even in business, this is disappearing. Is it still happening in academia in Canada?
Yes, it's not slowing down at all.
Is this on?
How's that? Testing? There we go. So the question is, it's slowing down? No, not at all. EDI, DEI is, if anything, accelerating. I see no difference at all. There's no effect. I think what is changing is just the thought and the ability to talk about it. I think that may be related to the Trump election. I think things have kind of eased up a little bit since that, but certainly not from a policy level. There's been no change.
Okay. Okay, Francis, I want to ask you about whether any colleagues support you. You know, this is a really important thing, and I know when Carol Hooman was on the panel we did in Washington, and I know from talking to her, is the biggest disappointment, and for those of us who have any problems at universities, the biggest disappointment is the people academics who support you privately will not do so publicly, and moreover, once they become administrators, they will definitely throw you under the bus even if they support you, because they're afraid to say anything. So have you received any sort of support from your colleagues at the university that at least, have any of them had the guts to speak out?
First of all, I just wanted to let John know that I wrote on because I don't like to talk behind people's backs, I wrote on my pad, coward, in large letters. So we'll talk about that later. But in terms of, yes, I have been very fortunate, much more fortunate than others. And actually, numerous colleagues showed up for the Justice Center Award in Calgary. And the most prominent are Sinclair McRae, who's a philosopher, Kirsten Kramer, a criminologist, Bob Huddle, a psychologist, Paul Johnson, who's an earth sciences person, Kelly Sundberg, who was the senior grievance officer, who was thrown under the bus for supporting me, and there's a number of others as well, Elaine Mullen. So about 10 very prominent colleagues at Mount Royal stood behind me. It made no difference because the university, Mount Royal University, is captured, and it's being run by very powerful equity, diversity, and inclusion activists who have banded together and have ostracized the people who try to help.
And I assume that former colleagues who became administrators, like chair of department or dean, they didn't, once they became administrators, they stopped supporting.
The chair is, the former chair testified against me at the arbitration. The dean is just unbelievably terrible. And of course the provost and president, etc., legal counsel were unbelievably treacherous. And the most important part of the story is the union. It was the union who got the university to go after me. That's the part of the story that is not known at this time. So you can imagine what it's been like for the last 5 years. Having to sit down with the union who I have no way out, I have to rely on them. And they're the ones who have been actively trying to push me out of the university and facilitating mechanisms that allow that to happen. It's just been unbelievably abusive. I can't stress that enough.
Okay, we'll get to you, Bruce. Kulvinder, I want to give you the opportunity. You talked about the problem you had, but I thought I'd give you a minute to talk about why you oppose lockdowns, because you never really talked about that. So the intellectual reason, rationale behind your position. So I thought I'd give you a chance.
So at the time, lockdowns went against all evidence that we had that was peer-reviewed prior to COVID coming on the stage. And in our Canada's and the World Health Organization's pandemic response plans, lockdowns were not a part of that because the lockdown harms were well known and they were well studied before COVID. And everything that we knew that was evidence-based back in 2020, there is now a multitude of evidence that has come forward since then, and all the fears that we had of the harms that were going to come forward, especially on the most marginalized, the poor, children, and also the developing world. It put 400 million people into food insecurity, and children's development was not only stagnated but permanently delayed. And there's a very large study that's come out of the UK just over the past week of nearly 250,000 children showing that these delays are permanent. And my background specialty is in pediatrics and also in allergy, clinical immunology, and I had done virology, vaccinology, and immunology research and vaccine development for the National Microbiology Lab, which is under the Public Health Agency of Canada for medicine. And so I was very well aware that the policies that were being put in place and the mandates that were put in place were not evidence-based. And as early as 2020, we knew based on the clinical trials, even for the vaccines, that the clinical trials showed that they were not designed to actually look at whether the vaccines prevented transmission or they prevented infection or they prevented mortality. So the messaging coming from the government was not based on evidence. And there is a large report that came out also last week within Canada from a legal think tank based in Calgary, which has gotten a hold of intergovernment documents, which shows that the Privy Council of Canada had a department within it that worked with Public Health Agency of Canada to modify Canadians' behavior and target messaging so that the government narrative would be believed. And so that's why it was very important for them not to have physicians and scientists that were questioning the narrative because it undermined their ability
to persuade based on their messaging. And there was politicians about the harms that were imposed. And I'm fearful that given there has been no reconciliation in terms of the facts and the harms that did come from government policy, that we are at a stage that if another pandemic or threat did come, be it a virus or any sort of government policy, that we lack the institutional trust to be able to put forward policies that the public would trust. And we also are in a place where lockdowns haven't had their day in court. So all the falsehoods that allow lockdowns to be imposed would allow them to come forward again.
Okay, thank you. This will all be fodder, I'm sure, for audience questions. Bruce, I had a lot of questions came to mind, but I'm going to choose one for you. Because you talked about science at the end, and as a scientist whose field would not exist if it were private, is there a way for science, is there a middle road where science can be a public activity, publicly funded, which is essential for a lot of science, but not public good, whereas where we can do one but not the other? So I thought I'd throw that out to you.
Well, I don't think so. If it is not a public good, then what is the rationale for public money? In other words, the difficulty is you're taking, the whole idea of public funding means that we are taking money from some people and giving it to other people to do what they think is important. So if that activity is not a public good, then I think the rationale for giving them public money is zero.
Well, okay, I mean, one could argue that knowledge is a public good, but not require context within that.
Well, you can say that about universities too, and about public schools.
Yeah.
And my attitude about universities has long been that universities should be private, and that they should not receive public money. That academics